we're going to use these 3 pieces of walnut to finish up our arcade.
Hi, and welcome to part 3/3 of this arcade build. Today we're going to be focusing on the arcade top. I wanted a way to continue having the walnut and cherry wood working together, but there really isn't much more to say here, so let's get right into it.
I started like I did before with milling the wood I had. Since this was rough sawn walnut, I brought it to the bandsaw to bring it down into pieces that were easier to flatten later. There were several knots in the walnut that needed to be filled, so I used my System 3 epoxy with black coloring. Make sure to mix the epoxy thoroughly so it cures fully. After the boards were filled, I cut them to size and cut the complementary angles for the frame. These angles were super important to get right, but luckily, I was able to fill the voids with epoxy to keep it strong. After the epoxy cured, I shaped the corners with my file. I designed the cherry door to rest on a lip and have invisible hinges. The problem was, because the angles on the miters weren't 45 degrees, the lips didn't line up. So, to fix that, I set up a little track on my router to go on to clean it up and make it look seamless. The cherry door needed to then get marked with the existing opening, which I cut at the bandsaw. Using a table saw would have just taken too long to set up, so I used the same piece of plywood and a router to cut on the line so it would fit. I did have to go and use my hand plane to both flatten and make the fit better for the door. I used the vent of the drill press to get starter holes for the invisible hinges. These hinges were great. They included a template for the 4 holes to drill, and after that I just needed to clean up the holes with a chisel. I just had to be very careful to not destroy the wood because of the thin parts, but the test fit was pretty great. After a quick test fit for the cherry door, I jumped back to the frame where I put a cherry spline into the corners. This added additional strength as well as some style to the frame. I did the final test fit of the door and noticed that one area was higher than the other. So I put in a support and used my joiner plane to flatten that area so it would be flush with the top of the frame. The oiling of these parts was very therapeutic. Enjoy the transformation. I know I did. I needed to prep the arcade body for the top. Some of the rails weren't in place, flush with the legs of the arcade, and therefore needed to be brought down. So using my handy number 7 joiner plane, I brought everything down to flat. Next I needed to route out the grooves for the hardware that would hold up the top to the body. I went with Z-clips because they were relatively inexpensive and I've seen them work before. The important thing about any of these kinds of hardware is that you consider the wood movement. 2 basic things to consider is the time of the year you're building and the grain direction. When I was deciding on the depth, I decided to use a spacer to make it easier to get the right spot. This should allow for enough wood movement so nothing breaks and the top stays securely attached to the table. For the frame, each of the 4 parts can get narrower and wider over time, but because I built this arcade in the summer, each part is likely as wide as it will be. So throughout the year, I need to give it room to become more narrow, mainly. Outside of some adjustments with the settings, adding additional ROMs, and some other basics, really the only thing left to do is just enjoy my creation.
Thanks for watching. If you have any thoughts on this build, feel free to leave a comment below. Otherwise, have a great day, and I'll see you on the next one.
Like and subscribe.